When you hear the name USS Laffey, your first thought will likely be the museum ship, a ship famous for enduring an absolute savaging by kamikaze attack. She was a survivor through and through. However, there was another USS Laffey in the same general time period, a destroyer that is famous in her own right for how she went down fighting. I've done a video on her story before, and will link that in the description. For the Cliff Notes version, however, USS Laffey DD-459 was a Benson-class destroyer, and a very new ship when the Pacific War began, having been launched on October 30th, 1941. She was commissioned on March 31st of 1942, before formally joining the war in September of the same year. Come October, the destroyer was already fighting ships much larger than herself. She got up close and personal with a Japanese cruiser, blasting the ship with her 5-inch guns. This was at the Battle of Cape Esperance. Laffey took no damage in return, allowing her to continue on in the Solomons. Unfortunately for Laffey, she would only last 2 months in the combat theater. By November of 1942, the ship was on the bottom. The destroyer, after fighting a heavy cruiser, went after a bigger target. During the naval battle of Guadalcanal, USS Laffey came extremely close to the Japanese battleship Hiei. Sources will vary on exactly how close, of course. A generally cited number is 20 feet, or 6 meters. So close that Hiei's guns couldn't bear on Laffey, while the destroyer merrily blasted away with literally everything she had, up to and including officers pulling out their sidearms to plink away at the bigger warship. This set fires aboard the Japanese capital ship and wrecked her superstructure. It didn't do any truly crippling damage, however, as Laffey pulled away, right into the metaphorical arms of Hiei's escorting destroyers. Sources disagree here on exactly how many destroyers. As few as 2, or as many as 4. Regardless of the exact number, these Japanese ships pounded Laffey in return. 5-inch shells slammed into the American destroyer. Hiei or Kirishima, it's a bit iffy on which one, landed at least one, possibly multiple 14-inch shells as well. What sent Laffey down, however, was a torpedo hit to her stern. This crippled her and left the destroyer vulnerable to further damage. Eventually, a magazine explosion sealed her fate. This blew off the back third of the ship and sent her to the bottom. 59 of her crew were killed, while 116 were wounded. Laffey is listed as having 247 men aboard, so that means 175 out of 247 were killed or wounded. Her captain, William Hank, went down with the ship. While the name Laffey would live on, as previously stated, the original Laffey vanished from history. Until, that is, 1992. Robert Ballard, the man more famous for finding Titanic's wreck, led an expedition to Iron Bottom Sound. This expedition found several famous warship wrecks, USS Laffey among them. However, between the technology of the time and a lack of survey time, there aren't a lot of photographs from this expedition. Laffey, in particular, only had a handful in Ballard's book, and I have never found even those pictures online. The pictures in this video, as a result, come from a much later expedition by our friends on RV Petrel. This came at the end of the 2010s, although there aren't many pictures here either. That disclaimer out of the way, let's look at those pictures now. I'll also link a couple videos in the description for those interested. Right. The first thing to note about Laffey's wreck is that the destroyer is resting upright. Or, at least, the remnants of the destroyer are upright. She's sitting in roughly half a mile of water, which is deep, although fairly shallow as these wrecks go. That's about 2,600 feet, or 800 meters, for reference. Here in the first picture, this is readily apparent. You have Laffey's bow still sticking up in the mud. She's covered in coral and other such things due to the relatively shallow depth, but Laffey's bow is recognizable. On ships that still retain their bow, this will always be the most iconic image, sticking out of the mud and slicing into the darkness like the ship was still sailing on the surface. For reference, here's a picture of Laffey doing just that. As for the next picture of the wreck, that jumps a bit further back, right to the bridge superstructure and the number 2 gun mount. Laffey continues to be covered in sea life, although it's not nearly as bad in this picture. The shape of the gun tub in front of the bridge is clearly visible, as well as what seems to be a 5-inch shell case sitting on the deck. On the topic of the 5-inch guns, the number 2 mount is broadly intact, at least as far as can be seen in this picture. The gun itself is still trained to port, where it had last seen use, firing on the Japanese, quite possibly on Hiei herself. As for the 20mm cannon directly in front of the bridge, those are in far worse shape. They're so coated in marine growth that the guns are almost unrecognizable. You can barely make out the gun shields and the barrel, but that's honestly about it. On the other hand, the bridge is rusted, but still visible. The next picture is an even better look at it, in fact. Here, the rounded shape of the bridge is shown quite clearly. Battle damage and decades underwater haven't done nearly enough to hide that. They have, however, eroded the bridge wings. Only a little bit of the frame is left in the center of the image. There's also an open doorway into the bridge, but the darkness makes it impossible to see inside. Although I imagine even if you could see inside, all you would be seeing is scattered debris. That said, I think the most impressive parts of this image are the intact wiring and portholes. You can still see wiring trailing down the side of the bridge. And in spite of the devastating amount of fire Laffey took, the bridge portholes are still intact and in place. A close-up of the previous surface picture of Laffey shows the bridge in service. And, speaking of intact equipment, the next picture shows Laffey's fire control director. This shows little in the way of damage, although there might be a shell hole towards the bottom that I've marked with an arrow. That's difficult to be sure, however, and could just be corrosion. Beyond that, the director is largely intact, just covered in the ever-present sea life. While there's not really anything to say the direction it's facing here, it is likely turned to port, just as the guns it once directed are turned in that direction, which is actually a good point to return to the weapons. One of the pictures Petrel took was of Laffey's torpedo tubes. While some of the confused reports of that battle state that Laffey fired her torpedoes at Hiei, these are still on the center line. It's not apparent here, but Ballard's book has a picture from a different angle that shows as much. The deckhouse and the torpedo tubes resting on the center line. In any case, the torpedo tubes are all intact and still in place. Unfortunately, from this angle, it's impossible to say if the torpedoes are still there. And for what it's worth, the quality of the picture in Ballard's book doesn't help much in that regard. That said, the next weapon after the torpedoes is another 20mm cannon mount. Exactly which one is difficult to say with any certainty. Laffey is listed as having 5 such weapons at the time of her sinking. 2 were in front of the bridge, as we saw earlier. A further 2 were on either side of the aft funnel. The 5th and final one, meanwhile, was mounted by her quad 1.1-inch cannon. This particular one might be from near her aft funnel, considering the ruined hull. It's hard to say for sure. In any event, the gun and mount are pretty rough, as you could expect. Regardless, this just leaves one more weapon, pictured by Petrel. A 4th 20mm cannon, this one atop much more intact superstructure. While the dark water around it makes it impossible to say for sure, this is also probably near the funnel. There's no sign of the quad 1.1-inch cannon. And as this picture of Laffey on the surface demonstrates, it was quite close to the 5th 20mm gun. That aside, there's not much else to say here. It's another coral-encrusted 20mm cannon with the remnants of a gun tub around it. There might also be a collapsed mast in the corner that I put an arrow pointing at. Past that, there's not much to make out, which only leaves a couple pictures. First, from the same area as the final 20mm cannon, we have a lower picture. Laffey's hull is ravaged here, with pieces collapsing in all directions. More of the marine growth is apparent as well. And yet, there are some surprisingly intact pieces here. For example, a ladder that looks almost pristine, considering the situation. And more impressively, a coil of thick rope that is not only intact, but still left where it was last mounted. 77 or so years underwater, as of when this picture was taken, and it's still there. That was most likely a mooring line. However, the next picture is rather less pretty. This is the furthest back of any picture Petrel took, and is looking directly at the aftermath of the magazine detonation. It is, as you could expect, very rough. The hull ending in a sharp cliff of broken and mangled steel, where the aft third was blown clean off. And, perhaps more striking, a piece of Laffey's hull bent up like a peeled can. Destroyers are often called tin cans, but rarely is it taken this literally. Without a better angle on the break, though, let's look at the final two images. These are both of the amidship superstructure, just from different distances. The further out image, seen here, shows the superstructure itself. There's also relatively little to make note of here. It's rusted and coral-encrusted metal. A porthole is clogged by coral next to a builder's plate. We'll be looking at that from closer in on the next picture. What's really notable about this one is the apparent 14-inch shell hole blown clean through the superstructure. As I said before, Laffey was hit by at least one heavy shell. No one knows for sure if it was Hiei or Kirishima, and it's difficult to say if it was only the one shell hit. Nonetheless, it's a striking image, a reminder of the pounding Laffey took, just like the break in her hull. As for the final picture, that's a much closer look at the builder's plate. This is covered in sea life and corrosion, but is still shockingly legible. It's difficult to read, as you could expect, but some things are still readable. Her name, for example, USS Laffey. This does, I think, make a good image to end on. There aren't many released images of Laffey to go off of, but this wraps them up nicely. Almost 80 years underwater, as of when these were taken, but even then, USS Laffey's builders had left their mark. Just as the men who served and died aboard her left their mark on the history books with their brave duel with Hiei. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.